So this guy was married, and he lived in the area of Mossman. And Mossman was a very well-to-do part of Sydney, very expensive North Shore part of Sydney. And he lived there with his wife and two teenage girls. The girls went to private school. He's working, his wife's working. Well-respected, people knew them in the area. On the surface, nothing to see here. There's no reason to suspect him. But they lived in his wife's mother's home, and a large home. And she, according to him, she was a tyrant and berated him and belittled him and told him he wasn't worth anything. And, you're only in this area, this house, because of my daughter and because of me. And made him feel fairly worthless. But having said that, his history was back in the 1950s, he migrated from England. He committed some rapes in England and moved to Melbourne.
Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you?
I am doing great tonight, Ray. How are you? And we have a guest from really far away with us today, and that is my good friend Kris Illingsworth, retired New South Wales, Australia police. She has all kinds of stuff to tell us. But Kris, welcome to Cold Red.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Ray. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honoured to be on your show.
Thanks,
Kris. We were just talking. We've been in touch by email and some Zoom calls. But we just agreed, we think the last time we saw each other was at the ICIF conference, International Criminal Investigative Analyst Fellowship, in Vancouver, British Columbia in 2007. And it's kind of unfortunate it's been that long. But anyway, good to see you here on Cold Red.
Yeah, that was the last time, but we have crossed paths a few times in the US, and you've come out here. So, we've kind of crossed over here and there over the years, over many years.
Kris invited FBI agents and actually an ATF agent. So it was me, Gene Regala, Supervisory Special Agent Profilers, and Ron Tunkel, profiler from Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearm, now Explosives. And we came there for 2 weeks of training to Sydney. And it was in 2004. Great experience. And we helped solve some cases. We'll talk about that. Then I took 2 extra weeks and a holiday, as the Aussies or the Brits would say, and explored up and down the east coast of Australia, I believe.
I think you went up.
Became scuba dive certified. I did, and to a few different places there, and I became scuba certified on the Great Barrier Reef, and that was another great experience. But Ray, why don't you start us off? You don't know Kris as well as I do. Maybe you can find a little bit about her background and what got her to the point that she's a guest on Cold Red. Because we don't invite just anyone on Cold Red, Kris, I'll have you know.
Yeah, I'm surprised we got Jim to come on, Kris, Usually, it's one of those things. It's a shot in the dark. But anyways, why don't you let us, our audience, know where you're from and what set you up to get into the career in law enforcement that you did?
Yeah, well, I'm from Sydney, Australia. Sydney is the capital of the state of New South Wales. And I grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney. So there's a Beach Boys song that has surfing at Narrabeen in one of the lyrics. And Narrabeen Beach, just down the road from where I grew up. I grew up at Newport. Went to the local school there. I was pretty sporty as a kid, and the lifestyle was great. The northern beaches are beautiful, beautiful part of Sydney. Spent a lot of time at the beach. That was pretty much the lifestyle. When I went through high school, they introduced surfing, surfboard riding, as a sport, but only in 1981, which is when I was doing my last year of high school, my HSC, high school certificate. And so it was a brand new sport, and only the men or only the boys were allowed to play that sport. The girls weren't. So the girls were just regarded as being surfy chicks on the beach. So that was kind of our role back then. It was a good lifestyle, but the northern beaches did become ground zero at one point in the 70s for heroin distribution. A distribution called Mr. Asia, and as it turned out, the principal of that group lived on the northern beaches, and so his henchmen were there too, and that was where they just distributed this heroin, and no one knew about heroin then. There was no education, there was nothing. So pretty ordinary families were getting caught up in it one way or another, and it kind of decimated a lot of people on the northern beaches then, despite it being so beautiful. Yeah, it changed a lot of lives back then. A lot of families were affected, ours was too. So yeah, it looked beautiful on the outside, but there was a definite undercurrent going on. So my sister actually moved to Melbourne partly to get away from it, and I was still a bit too young, so it didn't affect me. We went on to high school, did my HSC in 1981, and didn't know what I wanted to do or be. I had no idea really. And I did a few odd jobs, and a friend of mine who I went to school with, a good friend, so I was 19 at this point, just kind of bouncing around a bit, and a friend of mine said, "Why don't you join the police?" I'm like, "Well, that's crazy, no way." Nothing could be further from my mind. And then later, the very same day, my athletics coach, because I did track, I did the 400 meter hurdles. And my athletics coach, who didn't know my friend, said that afternoon, "Why don't you join the police?" And I thought, wow, there's something. Wow. How strange. I better look into that.
Double whammy in stereo coming at you.
Yeah, so I need to look into this. So I took myself off to the local police station at Mona Vale and grabbed one of their forms and filled it out and took it back the next day, and I was on my way towards the academy at that point. And I think it was 6 months later, I joined the New South Wales Police Force as a recruit at the old Redfern Police Academy. So these days, the police academy is a former college grounds. The police took it over, and they put through classes of about 300 these days. But back then it was Redfern, which was an inner city suburb, and that's where the old police depot was based. So it was pretty old, pretty antiquated, but they had the parade ground in the middle, just a grassy kind of oval shaped. And as we recruits quickly found out, you were not allowed to walk on that grass. The grass was hallowed ground. You could only go on there to march, for parades. And if they caught you, if the drill instructors caught you, or the PT instructors caught you folding your arms or with your hands in your pockets, they just went ballistic. The whole group would have to drop and do 20 sit-ups, 20 push-ups, or everyone would go for a run around the parade ground, which is around 300 meters or 220 yards. And it was a very strongly disciplined start to the police. And they come up to you, the police
Chris,
instructor.
If I can interrupt you, if I can interrupt you here, Ray, do you remember the FBI Academy?
I do.
There was the big basketball court in the gym. There was the FBI SEAL right in the middle. Mm-hmm. And the first day of FBI training, for special agents, the instructor's just standing back and they're waiting for someone to walk on the SEAL. And this is like day or 2 or 3 at most at the academy. And they catch that person walking across the SEAL. He or she has to do 20, 30 push-ups. The whole class does. In my class, it was Jim Clemente. And our listeners and our viewers know Jim, and he was put on the spot. So it's interesting how different academies, even 12 to 15,000 miles apart, they have that same sort of protocol to mess with students. Yeah. Certainly the first couple of days, first week, just to show them who's in charge. That's kind of what it's all about.
and to sort of break you down and make you just one of the numbers as well. Yeah, so
Chris, kind of wondering. I know what, and we've had several people on here that have talked about what it was like in the FBI Academy, what it was like in the police academy, some of the courses they took, some of the other things that they did. What was it like going through the police academy for New South Wales Police Department? And it wasn't just your police department. I take it was police departments from all over the area that went to this police academy?
Yeah, well, it's the New South Wales Police Force, so that's the entire state. And New South Wales is the largest physical geographic state in Australia. Oh, I beg your pardon, West Australia is. But we have the largest population. Currently, it's 8 million people. Sydney's got 5 million people today. So, yeah, it'd be recruits from all over the state of New South Wales who'd been accepted would come in. And our class had 90 in total, because the premises were smaller, a lot smaller. The buildings went back to about the 1920s or 30s, I think, a bit dilapidated. And the mounted police were also based there, and the mounted police is actually the world's oldest mounted police agency. And New South Wales Police Force is, I think it's one of the oldest. It goes back to 1789, I believe, when the penal colony was established here on Sydney Gadigal lands, Aboriginal lands. It was about a year after the colony, the white people came, that they decided they needed some kind of enforcement. And so the Night Watch police were formed basically to look after the convicts. And from that, the New South Wales Police grew. And back when I joined in 1983, in the police, there were only 10,000 police. And like today, there's about 18 or 19,000 police. But out of that 10,000, only 500 were women. So that's 5% were women. And the year before, in 1982, there was only 300 women, so that was 3% women. So I happened to join when there was a recruiting drive on. And, we went through the academy, 3 groups of 30-odd people in each, and did all the usual stuff, learned to shoot, handcuffs, all your, I'm not sure what you call them there, but guns, baton, handcuffs, they're all called appointments. And got trained on the appointments. One of the things I've learned in the police that I still use is typing. You had to type 30 words a minute, and if you didn't, you were out. And of course, we learn law, like everyone does. Learn law and practice and procedures. And mock courts, how to give evidence in court.
You know what's funny? And Jim, maybe you can back me on this. When we went into the bureau, we weren't allowed to type. Okay. If we were found to be on a computer in the field, they chased us off the computer and said, "We have people to do that. Your job is to be on the street." So right. I mean, that's in the late '80s when I came on. That's what it was. I don't know. Was it like that in New York, Jim?
Well, we didn't have a whole lot of computers in the late '80s when either of us started. But there'd be some typewriters you'd sit at and do a quick FD 302 or an insert or something, without getting into all the weeds here. But yeah, they would encourage you to get out. I hear nowadays a lot of the agents don't leave their desks for a week at a time because they're doing everything online, but that's today. And that's interesting. We don't have to have I always say to this day, one of the most valuable courses I ever took in my formal education was senior year in high school. And I'm talking back 70, 71 now. And this teacher was really cool. He would play like rock music on his record player in the back of the class. So I had all my math and English and history classes taken. So I had a whole year of just typing on a typewriter. I would never think I would need it again, but then I really didn't use it that much, except for graduate school, whatever. And then all of a sudden, when computers came about, and certainly in law enforcement, it was a very valuable tool to be able to type QWERTY and not just finger type like some people do. So I get good for New South Wales being ahead of its time there and then having its recruits go through it. Let me ask you this, Kris. You were an athlete, so did they do running and push-ups and sit-ups? You must have been maybe near the top of your class there, certainly among the women.
Yeah, I was reasonably fit. Could do plenty of sit-ups and push-ups. It was pretty rigorous. And, of course, like I'm sure you guys would have had to do it too, you had to pass the PT side as well. Yeah, so and then but once you joined, there was no PT after that. So that was probably the fittest I've ever been. Yeah, no, there's no physical test after.
Okay, so there were 90 in your class. How many men, how many women, and how many graduated of those 90, approximately?
I think most of us graduated. Maybe 2 or 3 didn't make it. And out of the 90, I think there was 10 or 12 women, so roughly 10%.
Okay.
And then I was posted to Mona Vale Police Station, which is where next door to Newport, where I'd grown up. And there were, I think, 10 or 12 women there, which was quite large. I think there was around 50 or 60 staff. So there was quite a high population of women there, high demographic. And, I knew Mona Vale area inside out, having grown up there. But we were in a district. It was called D District. And our division, which was Mona Vale, was 29 Division. And we would hear 6th Division, which was North Sydney, which was probably 10, 15 miles away, and 14 Division, which was Manly, which was probably 10 miles away. And they were busy stations. Mona Vale was pretty quiet and had the nickname of the lazy being from Mona Vale, or Koala Park was another nickname for the area, policing-wise. Because
only in Australia.
Yeah, not a lot happened. So I used to listen and hear these jobs. You'd hear the beep, a single beep job, which was get your attention. 2 beeps meant, okay, this is a serious one. And 3 beeps, which fortunately you didn't hear too often, was like a triple beep was a signal 1, as we call it, which is an officer is in need of assistance. So I used to hear all these beeps going on in 14 and 6th Division and go, gee, not much goes on in 29. So I actually applied to go to Manly, which is in 14 Division.
Mm.
And as I found out when I got there, this is about a year after I joined, it turned out to be the 4th busiest charging station in New South Wales, just behind the city stations like Darlinghurst, King's Cross and the Rocks. So Manly came next. So it was a bit of the Wild West going on at Manly. There was quite a few pubs, and you could guarantee every Thursday, Friday, Saturday night there'd be a brawl at one or more of those pubs. So it's pretty rough and tumble. And I think I learned in 3 months there what I'd learned in a year at Mona Vale.
There are some similar precincts and districts like that in the U.S. Just one last part of historical perspective in at least New South Wales. When were women first allowed, quote, to join the police? Like what year? You're now in 82 or so you joined, or 83 was it?
80.
But how many years had women been serving?
A long time, actually. Since I think it's from the 50s.
Okay.
But
they
had what was called like the women police. So that meant going into schools and giving talks to kids, standing at the pedestrian crossing with the lollipop going, yes, you can cross the road now, dealing with female victims. So it's very segregated. And then in 1981, I think it was, it fully amalgamated. So police women became equal on paper to police men getting the same pay, the same appointments, the same duties. And you can see in the 80s, women breaking through that ceiling. We had the first highway patrol officer, the female highway patrol officer, the first female police diver, the first female crime scene officer. So the 80s was really the breakthrough era for women or police women in policing in New South Wales. So yeah, it's good.
So within about 10 years, they went from handing out lollipops to breaking up bar fights.
Yeah. Yeah. And
you've come a long way, baby.
And we were issued at the academy like a Smith & Wesson 38 revolver, 6 shots, and you got a spare round of 6, so 12 shots, and your handcuffs and a baton, which had a metal tube through the middle of it, but was rubberized on the outside. But the baton was only about 10 inches long, and so the baton would fit into the men's trousers, and you wouldn't even know it was there. And they could pull it out before anyone even knew they had the baton out. And the women were issued handbags, so the guns, the handcuffs, the baton all had to go into the handbag, weighed a ton. And so you expected to go to a job wearing a handbag, particularly if you're in plain clothes. Uniform, you did have your appointments on your belt, so you had your leather belt on and your gun, handcuffs there. But if you're in plain clothes, it all went into your handbag. So I think there's been a few times when police women have clocked a few blokes with everything in their handbag just to get control. And of course, we were issued culottes. Policemen then were issued culottes, which they looked like a skirt, but they were actually, I guess you call them trousers down to the knees, but when you stood together, your legs together, they look like a skirt. And you could, in theory, run in those things. But you also had to wear stockings or pantyhose, and they gave us what I would call school shoes, barter school shoes, which were terrible because they had no slip on them, very uncomfortable. And I can remember running after some guy at night through Manly, wearing a foot pursuit, and had to jump a fence in this outfit. And made it over, but the culottes had so much material in there that, you get caught up with all the material going over a fence, and then you got to pick yourself up and get going again. So it was ridiculous. So I think it was about 1990 or something before they allowed police women to wear trousers, pants, and boots. Jeez. So hooray, we could actually be more operational rather than just look like a policeman would actually do operational work properly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I like talking, a lot of people, when we bring them on, police officers and detectives, when we bring them on Code Red, you don't hear much in this country, and probably not in Australia, about what it's like to be a patrol officer, to be a beat officer, they used to call it a radio car officer. But that's the bread and butter of what it is to be in law enforcement, certainly at a city or state level. And this is what, then eventually some police officers become detectives, which we're going to talk about that next with you. But you learn so much about the human condition, about society, about sociology, about family structures when you're a uniformed police officer going to these calls. And we've talked about this with other guests, but I was 23 years old, newly married at the time, no issues in my life, didn't grow up in a house with arguing and fighting, and you're being sent into these households of people married 20, 30 years, and the husband's beating up the wife, the kids are beating up the husband, the older kids. And I'm sure you had some experience like that. People are drinking, back, on drugs back in the day, if not still today. So you really have to be in good shape. You have to be a psychologist. You have to be a mediator, a mitigator, and and know the law, of course. So it's detectives and even FBI agents, because I was both. They have the luxury of mostly sitting in a desk. Paperwork comes, and you start reviewing the case from there. But if you're a cop on the beat, you got to know how to take care of yourself and how to bring down a situation that's a DEFCON 5, bring it down to a 1 or a 0.5, something like that. So So I do like hearing these stories. I know Ray enjoys that too. So at some point, you put in for detective division. Is that a promotion? You kind of raise your hand. You want to do it. How does that part work?
Yeah, I'd been doing uniform work, general duties as it's known, for 5 years. And I've been at Manly for 4 years at that point. I was getting a little bit tired of it. I kind of felt like I wanted to change. But I did actually get a tap on the shoulder from the chief of detectives at DY Police Station, which was the local detectives area. And he asked, would I come and join detectives? So I went through that process. You start off what's called an A-lister. You're kind of there with training wheels on, and they can boot you out at any time at that point. And I got through that, I think it was like a 3-month period. And then became a potential crime investigator, which was sort of a very junior detective. You haven't yet done the detective's course, but you're in the process of moving through it. And it was about a 2-year process, I think, which culminates in doing the detective's course. Not back at the academy for me then, but we were in a building in the city, a police building in the city. And I think a class of about 35 when we went through the D's course. And, you know, as you know, it's a step up from uniform work to detectives work, because I found it was like a whole new job. And you have to know the law so much more. It's such a higher level of understanding of the law and how to apply it. And put briefs of evidence together for, you know, the higher courts, the district courts, the Supreme Court. And yeah, it was a much more challenging job, which, you know, I liked. And DY detectives, you know, we covered a large area, Northern Beaches, and you got the whole gamut of crimes there, from murders to armed robbers to I think that's your area, Ray, stick-up guys. We call them stick-ups. And, everything, breaking into sexual assaults. And while I was doing that at DY, one afternoon, kind of close to knock-off time, around 4 p.m., we get a phone call in the office. It's just me and my workmate, John, and it's a elderly... It's a nursing home for elderly people up in Belrose. And there'd been over the course of about 6 or 8 months, there'd been several murders of elderly women on the north side of Sydney. Not so much in our area, or none in our area actually, but on the north side of Sydney. And we got called up to this nursing home, and they take us into their mortuary, and they say, we found her. Her name was Olive Cleveland. She was 81. We found her lying on the concrete footpath near the entrance to her building. She fell and hit her head, and there was blood on the pavement. And we thought we'd call you because there have been these other few murders, and we just thought we'd let the police know. And so we go in and have a look at her body, and there's some facial wounds with impact with the concrete. And they said, she's got a scarf on. And we looked at each other and we went, why has she got a scarf on? It's November, it's a hot day. And because that's our summertime. And anyway, my partner sort of gingerly looked at this scarf and sort of pulled it away carefully, and it wasn't a scarf. It turned out to be her leggings that she was wearing. And the offender, who was doing this to these other women, was blood force trauma, bashing their heads on the ground, on the pavements, and then rolling the victims over so they're face up, supine, and then removing their lower clothing and taking their stockings or pantyhose and using it as a ligature to strangle them with. And so that's what had happened to Olive. but because they thought she'd actually just fallen over, they'd already hosed the blood away from the pavement. So we completely lost the scene there. But she'd been last seen sitting on the bench, taking in the afternoon sun, and that was it. No one knew what happened beyond that. So it turned out later when the offender was arrested that he was working, visiting various locations around Sydney, selling a meat pie product. And he would go into nursing homes, and on this occasion he had seen Olive sitting on her own. So at that point, as you guys know, she was vulnerable and she was available. And so she didn't realise it, but she was at a medium to high risk from this offender. And he sat down next to her on the bench, he says, he later confessed to, and chatted to her. And spent a little bit of time, and she got uneasy, he said, and she got up and said, good day to him, and walked away from him. She had a walking stick with her. And then he's just followed her probably 10 or 15 yards and attacked her, pushed her down this ramp, this concrete ramp, out of view, and then pushed her down and attacked her. And then he had this thing where he'd take...
Chris, may I interrupt you? What time of day was this? Was it daylight? Were there other people around or other buildings that people could see this?
Yeah, this is around...
It's a high-risk crime.
Yeah, it was around 3:30 in the afternoon, summertime, so it's broad daylight. It's a bit like your time of year now, 4th of July time of year.
Sure.
But what he would do, because he had to take the pantyhose off, so he had to remove the shoes first. And he would put the shoes together neatly to one side of the body. And then he would place, after the attack, he would place the walking stick to one side also. And then he would display the victim. And so in the end, he would have stood over these victims and obviously felt very powerful over them and seen them laid out, humiliated, because even though they were deceased, for him, he was inflicting humiliation, degradation, and he would have been sexually aroused by that. He also used a hammer with some of these offences, and he kept a hammer in the car and would put it in his pocket if he thought there was an opportunity to attack. But on this occasion, because he was there for work, selling these meat pies, he didn't take the hammer, so he used the pavement instead. So yeah, Olive was number 4 of the homicide victims, but there was another one in between. There was an attempt, she survived, but the one who survived had dementia, as it turned out, so she couldn't offer any eyewitness evidence. And the next day...
Just let me hold, Chris, this was a preferential offender. You have a serial killer / rapist. Are all his victims elderly women, 70 and above?
Yeah, all of them were in their 80s or 90s. Although his
90s, wow.
His last victim was 60 or 61, but he knew her. And there wasn't actually penetration. There wasn't actual rape. But it was all, it was a rape fantasy going on. A very fantasy-driven crime.
Sure.
And these victims were his preferred type. And as it turned out, his mother-in-law, so this guy was married, and he lived in the area of Mossman. And Mossman was a very well-to-do part of Sydney, very expensive North Shore part of Sydney. And he lived there with his wife and 2 teenage girls. The girls went to private school. He's working, his wife's working. Well-respected, people knew them in the area. On the surface, nothing to see here. There's no reason to suspect him. But they lived in his wife's mother's home, and a large home. And she according to him, she was a tyrant and berated him and belittled him and told him he wasn't worth anything. And, you're only in this area, this house, because of my daughter and because of me, and made him feel fairly worthless. But having said that, his history was back in the 1950s, he migrated from England. He committed some rapes in England and moved to Melbourne. And then he's known to have committed a couple of rapes in Melbourne. He was convicted. And then he's suspected of a couple of murders down there too. But he meets his wife-to-be in Melbourne, and he pretty quick moves to Sydney, having committed these offences in Melbourne, Victoria. Sets himself up in this well-to-do suburb, gets a job, and everything seems good. But his mother-in-law died just a couple of months before the first murder happened. And when he later was arrested and interviewed, he told the police that if you look carefully at these victims who he did attack, they all look just like my mother-in-law. They didn't. They were just elderly, like she was. So, yeah, it was all about retribution and revenge and expressing anger and in a sadistic kind of way, although the victims were deceased.
Is this the same case where there was some controversy, there was DNA collected, or is that a different case?
Different case, yeah. This guy...
so anyway, you help. How was he eventually caught, this guy?
Well, they formed a task force the day after our incident with Olive Cleveland. And my partner and I got onto the task force, and we worked on that for 6 months. And there was another murder during that time, 91-year-old Muriel Falconer. She was killed as she entered her home, having just walked up in the shops in Mossman, done her shopping. And this was at a time when everyone's looking for this murderer. But we didn't know who it was. There were no clues at that point as to who it was. And, we had other suspects, but this guy wasn't on the radar. And after he killed Muriel Falconer, he basically pushed her through a front door into the house, shut the door, and then did the same thing to her. And he would also rob these victims too. He would steal their money. And then he'd go up to the local Mossman RSL or the Mossman pub, and he'd drink their money or gamble it. But he did Muriel's murder having parked just outside the police station to go into the pub. And while he was in the pub, he saw Muriel walk past, and, the light went on, and he went out and he followed her, and he killed her. And afterwards spent the money at the pub opposite the police station, and we were actually working in the police station at that point. And, it all happened. And then, of course, she gets found that night, and, it all kicks off again. So someone did see him. We had 2 eyewitnesses who had seen an older man. He was 58 or 59 at this point, and he had silver hair. So he looked like an older man, and nothing otherwise noticeable about him. He looked like he belonged to the area. And we went back, and one of the detectives found that, hang on a sec, an older man or an elderly man has been spotted near a couple of other ones too. So it all kind of snowballed from there, and he had gone into other nursing homes and sexually assaulted by touching other victims who he did not physically assault. And one of the places he went into was the place where his mother-in-law had been in a hospice, and the nursing staff recognised him as touching up one of these elderly women. And so the police were called to that. And those police collected a note from that. Sorry, those police arranged to interview him. And the next day he tried to commit suicide, and he wrote a suicide note, in amongst which he wrote, "No more grannies." And so that later became crucial evidence in our serial murder case. And we got onto him that way. That's how we identified him. And he must have known he was under surveillance because he was doing counter surveillance work, or taking counter surveillance measures. And he'd get out of the car, go into a nursing home type place, and be followed in by the surveillance police. Then he wouldn't do anything, he'd come back out and leave. And then one day he walks, he's got a suit on, he's, we've got listening devices so we know what he's doing. And he goes, we know he's going to meet a family friend who had a connection to a lawyer. So it was kind of like a business meeting. And during the day, around midday, and he's observed by the surveillance police to go into the house in Mossman, carrying a briefcase. And it looked like it was, we knew he knew her as well. There'd been some kind of relationship that they'd had. And surveillance police sat outside. A few hours go by, and then the school kids, her grandkids, come by, and they knock on her door, and she doesn't answer. So that was the alarm bell. And eventually police go in, they find that she's been murdered in the same way, and he's lying in the bathtub having taken pills and overdose and alcohol. But, the detectives fish him out of the bathtub, and he eventually is interviewed and confesses and admits to all of it. Went to jail, got a life sentence, and committed suicide in prison after doing a few years, maybe 10 years or so. Yeah, so that was my first experience with a very complex, protracted investigation, serial murder investigation. And in Australia, fortunately, we don't get too many serial murder cases. So yeah, it was an experience. And that was one of the experiences that set me up.
Is it fair to say, that's exactly what I was going to ask you, is it fair to say, being this much ingratiated into a case or involved in a case, that you realize the behavioral characteristics of sexual offenders and it became a professional interest of yours? And then somewhere along the way, the term profiling came up. I know there was at least one other profiler in Australia, at least of whom I was aware. But next thing you know, you're talking to maybe your supervisors, maybe the FBI, and you are actually pursuing the possibility of becoming a fully trained profiler, just like the second or third ever in Australia, right?
Yeah, that's right. What I saw in that task force with the Granny Killer Task Force, North Shore Murders Task Force, was a forensic psychiatrist. We used to send surveillance information to him and listening device information to him, telephone intercept information. And my partner and I had to type, these intercepts up and like a transcript. And the forensic psychiatrist would work his magic with this behavioral analysis to come up with a profile and to explain motivations. And I remember sitting back and going, wow, all we did was type up raw information that we were getting, and he's converted it into this amazing scenario. How did he do that? He's painted this picture with the same information that we had, but we didn't paint the picture like he did. So I found that fascinating. And then, later I went through, from there I went into witness protection, I didn't go into witness protection, but I worked in witness protection. And
we know what you meant.
Yeah.
Tactical work, close personal protection work. And whilst there was another serial murder case, the backpacker murders case, which was known as Task Force Air. And that was a series of 7 known backpackers who'd been murdered, found in a forest south of Sydney, the Belanglo State Forest. That was between 1989 and 1992. And so I was selected to go into that task force as a detective, and I had also done the intelligence analyst course whilst I was doing the tactical stuff. So I was a forward tactical officer for the TAC teams and the negotiators. And so I worked in the task force as an analyst and as a detective as needed. And I was on that task force for 3 years. So again, another very protracted, complex criminal investigation into interpersonal violent crimes. And one of the jobs I had on that task force was to review everything to do with the victims and to compile a single document. And because there's 7 victims, so 8 columns, seven victim columns, listing everything from, physical description, what last seen, persons who last saw them, through to the crime scene.
Chris, you later learned there's a word for that, isn't it?
Victimology.
Victimology.
Yeah, never heard of it at the time. But yeah, the study of the victim.
Same.
So I did that. So I knew the victim stuff inside out and ended up with a document about 2 inches thick that I compiled with every single piece of data in that document had to have a source document. So like statement of so-and-so, paragraph 33 or page 7. So yeah, everything was sourced. And that became kind of like the Bible for the task force, all things to do with the victims. And then, so we got onto that offender, and within 6 months of identifying the offender, we had him, or who we thought could be the offender, we had him in court. And I gave evidence at the committal into this serial killer. And then it proceeded to the Supreme Court, and he was convicted and received life sentences. So I was in court there when the jury handed down their findings and the guilty plea, and I was sitting in front. The court had an upstairs area, and there's a bunch of us detectives from the task force and some crime scene guys who'd worked on it. We're all sitting together, and I was sitting next to one of the crime scene guys, a ballistics guy, and the families were just sitting behind us, and we could look down onto the courtroom, and the jury came back and announced for every charge guilty. And I can tell you there were a few tears in that front row of detectives, and of course with the families behind us. But yeah, he was convicted, got a life sentence, multiple life sentences. And he too died in prison, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago.
So you're getting introduced to behavior profiling, even if that word isn't coming up. You're doing a intense and detailed victimology of all the murder victims. And then somehow what comes first, the Wee Waa rapist case or getting into profiling? Are they kind of closely linked together?
Yeah, getting into profiling first. So the profiler that you mentioned before was Robin Kilmire in South Australia. She did a VI-class course, which is the Violent Crime Linkage Analysis System course, like your VICAP at the FBI. This is a behavioural linkage way of linking across crimes, because this is pretty much before DNA was a real thing, because DNA was just kind of coming to the fore. So I managed to get on that because I've been on these 2 serial murder task forces. And from that, I'd seen with the backpacker murders, the same forensic psychiatrist, he worked his magic again with what he could do. And I said to, the bosses, like, we could do this if we have some internal training. It's more cost effective. This is the program, the ICIF, the International Criminal Investigative Analysis Fellowship, which, as you know, comes from the FBI origins. And I wrote a report saying, New South Wales should have this. And, pick me. I've done this. This is my experience with serial murders and linking. And I was fortunate enough to be selected to represent New South Wales. And 5 of us around Australia were selected from 5 policing agencies. And we trained initially under Bronwyn, and we had 3 weeks. Bronwyn was working in Canberra then. And we had 3 weeks in 1997, the start of our training, when FBI agents came out to Canberra to train us. And your colleagues, Jim, Marie Dyson, Drew Wells, Mike Napier, and we got immersed into profiling concepts and typologies for 3 weeks there, which is amazing. I remember the learning curve was just like that. didn't matter what I knew before, like the behavioural side was so different to criminal investigation work. Because, as you guys know, as an investigator, you have to find information, you have to find evidence. Is there enough to make a charge, lay the evidence, make a brief for court? Whereas this, you're using all of that knowledge and experience and the case information to look at it behaviourally. The what happened, the why did it happen that way? Who would need to do those things in that way? And the core behaviour, like the physical aspects, the sexual aspects, the verbal aspects. So it was a whole mind-bending new way of looking at a crime. So that was 97, 1998. We returned to Canberra, and because we're now in the understudy program, and two other agents came out, Ron Tunkel and Kevin Kelm from ATF, and did more training for us there. And meanwhile, I was working in my agency as pretty much as a profiler, even though I had the training wheels on. And then my bosses expected me to train as well. So I was going down to our police academy now at Goulburn and teaching detectives courses when I was kind of only just learning myself. So I was thrown in the deep end, and I was the only one in my agency. So I always was so envious of you guys there at the FBI because you had a whole bunch of you doing it. So you could bounce stuff off one another, call a conference. I wish I got to experience when I was there.
Makes a big difference. Makes a big difference early on, yeah.
Yeah. And so it was in that period, so in 1999, when the Wee Waa rape case came up. And Wee Waa is a small town, population of around 2,000 people in the northwest of New South Wales. So probably around 300-400 miles away from Sydney. And it's in the outback. Dead flat ground area, orange, red dirt, spinifexes. But the area, because it was flat, was agricultural for cotton. So it was a cotton growing area. And they'd have a cotton picking temporary workforce move through town. And so when the rape occurred of 91-year-old Rita Knight in her home one night, people thought, well, it won't be a local person. It'll be one of these blow-in cotton pickers, and they've skipped town. So no one wanted to believe it could be a local person. So Rita Knight had been asleep in bed in her home that she grew up in. She'd been there all 91 years. She never married, had no kids. She had lived there with her sister, again, not married, no kids. And the sister had died. Her parents had obviously died. So she lived there alone, and she lived. Her bedroom was the front of the house onto a veranda at the front street. And that night, as she always did, she went to bed at her usual time. And later that night, the offender went to the rear of the house and turned off the power at the meter board. So if she had managed to turn the light on, nothing would have happened. The light would not have come on. So that straight away told me that identification is an issue for this guy. And he broke some glass in a window, put his hand through the door, went to the front bedroom, and power reassurance rapist. He used the surprise approach while she was asleep and basically jumped on her and raped her and put a pillow over her face, but probably to stop the screaming rather than to try to kill her. Elderly people, you've just got to touch and, skin comes away. So terrible bruising, terrible skin damage. And she was sexually assaulted and semen was found internally. And she managed to, after the offender left, she managed to go out into the veranda, and happened to be New Year's Eve, like that night, it was New Year's Eve night, and some revellers went by and she called to them and they came to her assistance. So I think it was about 4 or 5 months later, the detectives from that area found me as a profiler in Sydney and asked me to look at the case. So I wanted to go to the scene, but my boss wouldn't let me. He wanted my bum on the seat. So I couldn't go there, which is unfortunate because you learn so much more. As you know, you learn so much more when you go to a scene. You can see the options that are available and the choices that are made by the offender. So I didn't go there, but I worked the case with the information they gave me. And I said, well, identification's an issue, so he's going to be known to her. He knew where the power board was. He knew that an elderly lady was in there by herself. So he had to have known her. He had to have been in there before. Most likely this would be someone who's an acquaintance of some kind. She kind of kept to herself. So it's more likely to be someone who visits the place, her home, to do maintenance, or maybe some nursing care, something like that. It was women who did the nursing care, so it's more likely going to be like the maintenance guy or the gardener. And I actually put that in the report. So the case went unsolved still for another year. And by this stage, we had in New South Wales a British police commissioner who'd come out from Browns Hill Police College, which I had an opportunity to go to. And the police commissioner brought out 2 of his British, excuse me for a sec, my little dog needs something. She might want to go out. No, so far so good.
We can take an edit if you want. We can edit if you want to go do something real quick.
Oh, I think she's just going for a glass of water, a drink of water. She might want to go out in a minute though.
Our expert producer can cut this part out and just keep going on. So the Bromhill inspector is there and with 2 other people.
Yes, so the British police commissioner that we had brought out 2 British superintendents. One of them was named Robin Napper. And Robin's job was, he was tasked to basically bring New South Wales police into 20th century then with DNA. And because they'd been using DNA quite well in the UK, and they had the Colin Pitchfork case, which is the famous case that started it all off. So Robin identified the Wee Waa rape case, which by now is about a year and a half unsolved, as a great one to use as a demonstration of the power of DNA, because Wee Waa was so isolated in the outback. It had a basically contained population. Only out of the 2,000, about 500 eligible men that could possibly have been the offender. So he devised a way to run this DNA mass screening operation to collect DNA from the 500 men on a voluntary basis, and the DNA would be destroyed immediately afterwards. If it didn't match Rita Knight's rapist, it would be destroyed. But the problem was that because DNA was quite early then, the laboratories didn't have great capacity for volume. So to do 500 samples literally would have taken 6 months and not done another case around New South Wales. So we had to find a way to prioritise these samples. So I did a behavioural questionnaire where you asked behavioural-oriented questions. And, as you know, they're designed to elicit answers from the offender. The idea is that the offender's answers are different to everyone else's answers, with some key questions. Not all of them, just some key ones. If you've got the right type of offender. It's
a valuable investigative tool. You wouldn't use it in the courts, but it helps narrow the suspect pool to 2 to 5 people, sometimes, maybe a few more. But yeah, it's a great tool if put together.
Yeah, that's right. It's great for prioritising. So I wrote this questionnaire that had 10 questions. it was handed out as the samples were collected. And again, it was all voluntary. And this was not only the first time that there was a mass DNA screening operation in Australia, but the first time the behavioural questionnaire had been used on a mass basis, and also the first time that barcoding had been used. Like, I put a barcode sticker on the exhibit, the DNA exhibit, and on the questionnaire, so the two would be linked, and then you follow the exhibit. So again, that was, the British way of doing things. So, we definitely learned from that. And my job, well, at the time there was no sexual assault unit in New South Wales policing, no rape squad at all, which speaks to the times. And so the homicide squad ran this operation. Under Robin's guidance, but under the direction of the homicide squad, we went out to Wee Waa. There's like a dozen of us that went out. And the DNA circus rolled into town. We had forensic caravans, and we set that up at the police station. There was media with it. It was a whole media circus too. And we had our briefing was done at the local RSL, the Returned Services League. It's like the local drinking water hole. That was our briefing point. And, I had to brief all the police who were there, who'd come in from around the areas to do the mass screening. So I was briefing them on the questionnaire and how to deliver it, not to help anyone. If a question was asked about the questionnaire, the answer was to be, just do the best you can. It's okay if you don't complete it, but just do the best you can. And so off they went, armed with bags of DNA kits and questionnaires. And I have to give it to the town. They really supported this operation. The town came out in force. I think out of 500 odd, there was only 2 or 3 that objected. One was a local lawyer. Yeah, and my job at that point then transitioned to being in the police station, which, if you were to look at the police station, it's got this crazy pitched roof to it, which doesn't suit the rest of the area at all, because it's the outback. But what had happened was that the police station was built a few years earlier, and there'd been a mix-up with Public Works, and it was actually the Jindabyne police station that got delivered to Wee Waa. And Jindabyne is in the Snowy Mountains, so that's why it had this massive pitched roof. So, we'll just build it anyway in Wee Waa. A flat pack, put it together. So this crazy looking police station, and I had this tiny little, what would have been like the boot room for the ski lodge. This small boot room, and they'd bring the forms to me, and I would go through all 10 questions, and I had 3 piles, and I put a piece of paper with each pile, low, medium, high, as to what's the likelihood of it being the offender's form. And I got up to, I think we're on day 2 or day 3, and I was up to 330 of these forms, looking at all 10 questions on each one. And the detectives would come to me and go, "Have you got him yet, Chris?" I'm like, "No, he's not here. Keep going." And all of these forms were going into the low pile, low priority, all of them. Keep going. And then Robin came and saw me and said, "Hey, come downstairs. There's one of the local uniform guys wants to tell us something." So going back to the sexual assault time, they were aware of, they had their own list of people. They had 24 people drawn up as suspects. And one of the people on this list of 24, they noticed had skipped town in the days after Rita Knight's assault. And then the same person had come back, and then when the DNA circus came to town, they skipped town again. And they went to a town further west called Barorona, about 200 kilometres away, 200 miles. And this uniformed local guy thought that this guy could be good for it. And what's his background? Oh, well, he's got some sexual assault history in women's homes. he was Rita Knight's gardener. I'm like, yes, like, let's get his DNA. And,
absolutely.
So it turned out that the terms of reference for the operation was just to be conducted in Wee Waa. He was in Barorona, 200 miles away. So the homicide guy said, "Oh, well, no, it doesn't fit the terms of reference. We can't do it." We're like, "Hang on, this is probably him. We have to." And they went, "No." And so Robert Napper just tasked this guy, because he was actually a senior rank. He just tasked this guy and went, "Go get it. Take the kit, take the questionnaire, go get it. See if he'll volunteer." So he goes there, he knocks on the guy's door at Barorona, and apparently he was shaking a lot when he filled out the form and gave his DNA. And the uniform guy comes back, and a few hours later he's back at the police station. And I look at the form, I go through the 10 questions, and I'm like, oh my God, this is him. This is it.
Wow.
There were 2 questions that he answered that were totally different to the other 330. I might as well say what they are, because I don't think it's going to be used again. One was, do you think the person who did this would be feeling sorry for what they've done? And he was the only one to write yes. And then the other question was, do you think the person who did this deserves forgiveness? 2 people wrote yes. He was one. The other person was the local priest.
Interesting.
Yeah. And when you look at all these questionnaires, they were interesting in themselves, in that they were a real social study, because they showed some interesting things about the community, including what they thought should happen to the offender. And some common ones were tie him to the back of a ute, which is like a pickup truck, and driving through town on the end of a rope. And another one was tie him to the local cenotaph, which is like a plinth, and leave him there and stone him as well while he's tied there. Another one was put him in stocks. Yeah, some really medieval stuff came out. It was very interesting on a social level.
They are those are definitely not the offender who are writing things like that, or at least you put them on the low list, without a doubt. That's an amazing story. Obviously, he was arrested. I assume he confessed and prison for life.
Yeah, he confessed. His story was that he'd had a domestic with his former wife, or he had an altercation with her. He was intoxicated. It was New Year's Eve, and he knew she lived there, of course, and was in the area as he walked past, and just went, "Yep, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take out my anger about my wife, and sexual aggression on her." Yeah,
an opportunist in that regard.
Yeah.
These are some great cases. I want to segue into something you went through just a few years ago. In 2004, you invited me, Gene Regala, another profiler, and Ron Tunkel to train some of the officers in New South Wales. I mentioned that early on. And you had me sit through a few case presentations. And just real quick here, not going to get into any details, but at the time there was a serial rapist striking in Sydney. And I'll never forget sitting in the room with the detectives, police officers, bosses, and you were there. And they were describing the crime scene. And this all happened pretty quickly. And they're telling me, in 3 of the 6 rapes, the person was walking down the street, down the driveway into the house, carrying a torch. And for about 5 seconds, my brain didn't connect a torch to flashlight, which the Americans would say, as opposed to Aussies. I'm thinking for like 5 seconds, this guy is carrying like a stick with a fire at the end, and you haven't caught him yet. But before I said anything out loud, my British American dialect wall kicked in. Wait a minute, a torch in the UK and Australia is a flashlight. So There was that one too. And we also worked a case where a utility company, the women that were working there were getting all kinds of letters sent to them. And I'm not going to get into the details because this is actually one of the final exams I give at Penn West University, where they look at all these writings. And we helped you put together a profile. You helped us too, the four of us. And we turned that over to the police detective. And it turned out to like really match one of the people involved. We'll just leave it at that without giving anything away to any future students who may be listening or watching here. And I always felt that it was very helpful. And you got a write-up from that detective. And again, I'm still not going to go into details, but this detective really put information together from a behavioral perspective. We could tell you we're kind of guiding him into what we were looking for. And it really gave us a very good indication of what a serial harasser or threatener, how his activities are and what his whole life was about. So that was a great 2004 trip for me. And of course, we've stayed in touch then. So real quick, walk us through, you retired and you went into consulting, but you want to add something, I can tell.
Something. So just on that, I do distinctly, and I'll probably never forget this, you guys are staying at the Intercontinental Hotel down in Sydney near Circular Quay, near the harbour. And I just remember the four of us sitting around going through this case. We all had copies of the material and we had our texter highlighters out, and you were kind of leading the charge with Ron as well, who was great with the statement analysis stuff. And we're writing up, doing this linguistic analysis on this case. And I'd done
50
training.
Different letters. Let me just add about 50 letters. So a lot there.
Yeah. So it was a great experience for me sitting there, intensely with you guys, just in this hotel room. It was terrific. And I just want to go back to that torch thing that you mentioned. When I was in America, I remember I gave a case presentation to somewhere, and I think it was in Florida, and I mentioned that the offender was carrying a torch. Everyone just looked at me like, what? I got the same reaction, but in reverse.
It's amazing the differences in our dialect and the lexicon, even though we all speak English between our two countries and the UK. Different words can, of course, mean different things. So you retired not too long ago. Ray, did you have something to add here?
Yeah. Chris, I wanted to, before we move into this next segment here, I have a question that I know our listeners would love to know. Now, here you are, someone from a different country, 15,000, 18,000 miles away. You come to the FBI Academy, you're trained, okay? And the FBI Academy featured Silence of the Lambs, and you got a chance to work with real criminal profilers. But the thing is that I know that what you see on TV comes nowhere near to what real life is. So my question is, when you look at everything that's on TV, what would you say best depicts the work that you do and the other criminal profilers did in the FBI?
What aspect of the TV show?
Yeah, what aspect would it be? A TV show? Would it be a documentary? Would it be a series? Something that was done, and I know that although it's sensationalized on TV, it never comes even close to what it is in real life. And besides that, the easy cases that you see on TV, like in Criminal Minds, that are solved in an hour, they're not that easy. You don't get a chance to profile a case unless it's very, very difficult and nobody else can. But what show do you recall seeing, whether it be Silence of the Lambs, Mindhunters, any one of those shows that comes closest to what profilers really do? I know our listeners would love to know.
Well, Mindhunters was, pretty accurate, I thought. But Criminal Minds, I know. Mm-hmm. The thing with the Criminal Minds show is that it shows them collaborating, working on it together, which is what really happens. The Mindhunters one obviously had the historical thread through it, so there was accuracy there, and told a good history to how profiling came into being. I just remember loving the collaborative approach, and you'd be in the office there in the BAUs, and you'd hear on the loudspeaker overhead, 2 p.m. there's a conference in conference room 1. Anyone available? Come on in. It's a threat letter series, or it's a homicide, or it's a rape series, and you'd go in, say, an hour or so before the conference call with the detective. So one of the profilers would be running the case, and then line up a conference call with the detective, which could be anywhere in the US. And then we'd go in there, it might be 4, 5, 6 of us, just whoever was available, and just work this case for an hour and throw some stuff around, see what we generally all thought, and then would sit around the teleconference call, talking to the detective, and I think you guys would call it spitballing, throwing stuff around, and it was just a terrific learning process for me, and to watch it all in action, and just be envious. And I do recall sitting in on one of these, and it involved a case from a town in Mississippi, a small town in Mississippi, and the local mayor was getting threat letters. And we worked this case, and we thought this is probably a female in the workplace, and we took the detective through our analysis and linking the letters, the authorial attribution. And at the end of it, of course, coming from Australia, I'm hearing all these different American accents, because such a broad range of accents that you've got over there. And this guy being from the South, I'm like, wow, here I am in the middle of a BAU conference, the FBI, listening to a detective from the South. I'm like, I do remember feeling like I was a kid in a candy store. I just thought, I'm here, I've made it,
He was no doubt dropping a lot of y'all and only y'alls, and it takes me a while to translate some of that too.
Yeah,
but I hope we solved the case. I don't know if you remember that one or not.
Yeah, June and July, and at the end of it, we'd finished the thing, and everyone's kind of saying goodbye, and I didn't realize it's kind of a no-no to say something about accents, southern accents, and at least back then it might have been. And so I didn't know that, but I just said, and the guy's name was Rusty. and I said, as I was signing off, I went, "Hey, Rusty." And he goes, "Yes, ma'am." I go, "I love your accent." And he goes, there was silence in the room, because everyone went, "Oh," she said, the southern accent thing. And there's a momentary pause from Rusty, and then he goes, "Well, I just loved yours."
That's a good imitation, actually. That's a good imitation.
That's good. That was good.
Well, here's a southern thing. If he said back to you, "Bless your little heart," that's not a good thing coming from the South.
Okay.
They don't really mean it literally. It's like,
right.
You're an a-hole, but I'll tell you to bless your little heart. Good story. Thanks.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, so it was a great experience being there. And being at the FBI Academy too, and, seeing the Yellow Brick Road and where Silence of the Lambs have been filmed, and I was just like, wow. And because I stayed at the Academy for the month in the Jefferson Building, I think it's called, had a nice room with a view over the firing range. And, I loved how you could drive through the Quantico Marine Base, and there's, you've got the security, the Marine security as you enter the Marine base before you can get to the FBI Academy. And there were 3 guys who were always there checking, ID and checking your car and everything as you come in, as you know. And I'd go through this process each time, and I think I was there for a month, and I think after about 3 weeks, I worked up some bravery to stop one time and chat to them. And then I get out of the car and I go, "Oh, I'm from Australia, so could I get a photo with you guys?" So I've got this photo of these 3 Marines, and they're armed to the teeth. So I've gone click, and then I go, "Can you get a photo of me with you?" So one of them takes the camera, and he's like, camera, firearm, shotgun. Do you want me to hold that for you? So I've got this photo of me with the Marine guys. Yeah. And just driving through the forest, through the woods there, to get into the academy itself. And there's a photo of us there, Jim, at the sign, the FBI Academy sign in the snow. And there's another one of me in summer.
If you're only listening to this, go check the YouTube version of this. We're going to put some pictures up, including some very graphic pictures. And Ray, why don't you kind of walk, Kris, if this is okay, to maybe kind of wind up our conversation here. You went through something really tough about four plus years ago. Ray, why don't you kind of walk Kris through this? And it's going to be amazing what she has to share with us here.
Well, a few years ago, Kris, you had quite a scare regarding a bushfire near Sydney. What is a bushfire? Tell our audience what that is, and how common are they in Australia?
Well, bushfire is our name for what you'd call a wildfire. So it's a forest fire. I don't live in Sydney. I live in a rural area.
And this is 2019, just so we're clear, correct? Kris, I know this is kind of emotional for you, but just to give some perspective, I did some research before this. We're going to close out here in a few. I know this is tough to talk about. From my numbers, and this is around New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, 2019 into 2020, at least 34 people died directly from the flames. Almost 450 died from smoke inhalation, and about 10,000 homes were destroyed. And yours came very close, but your home, which you're sitting in right now, it actually survived, thanks to probably some of the you were kind of pushing it close there. Some people may say, don't worry about the house, get the hell out to save your life. But you did make it, and you're here to tell us about this now. So that's an amazing story. And I can't imagine living through something like that. And about 6 weeks ago, we did a Zoom call. I picked up the emotion in your voice then, and we could certainly hear it now. Ray, any questions here to kind of wrap this part up?
No, I guess the one thing that I'd want to know, and I'm sure our listeners do too, if this happened, and God forbid if it ever happened again to anybody, but what would be the one piece of advice you would give to them? That's great advice. That's great advice, Kris. Kris, I hope that nobody ever has to heed that advice you just gave. I wish that on nobody. I'm amazed by your story. I'm awed by it. You're really something.
And
that sounds like it. It sounds like it.
Kris, let's leave it with this. We're going to wrap up here. You gave us 2 hours of your time. Thank you very much. You have a website, you have a company you started. Obviously, you're cool as a cucumber under pressure, and that's good for any potential clients to know. But you also do investigative consulting, behavioral and threat assessment. How can people reach you, and if they want to engage your services? It's great to know, and I'm sure you will have some clients. We have a big following in Australia, so relatively speaking anyway, getting bigger all the time. Ray, I want to close it out. Any final words on your part?
No, Kris, it's been great. Thank you so much for spending time with us and our audience. I'm sure everybody appreciates what you've gone through and what you've done in your life. What a career you've had. Thank you.
And ditto for that, Kris. You're a good friend after all these years, and let's hope one of these days, before too much longer, we get to visit with one another. I'll make sure to check that map of your area, though. Red, yellow, black, before I actually drive through there. I'm not trying to be funny, but someone should have, anytime wildfires are around you, you should have access to that kind of information. So again, thank you, Kris. Thank you, Ray. Everyone, thanks for listening or watching, or both. Check us out on all our social media platforms. Check out coldredpodcast.com. Please subscribe. Please like all those good things. Thanks to Rick Schilling, our music director. Matt Robinson, Matt McLaughlin, our two producers, and we will see you next time on Cold Red.
Thanks, Chris.
Wow. You know, Ray, in Australia, 2 hours there is only 1 hour. So that's why the time, everything's different. Water goes down the toilet differently, and time is suspended there. So, but no, every minute was interesting. Of course, this will probably be 2 episodes when our producers